Hello, this is Ron Gerber from Angel Beat. I'm so glad that Steve, one of AWS's top solution architects down there in Florida, is able to speak on disaster recovery. And many times when people think about DR in Florida, they think about hurricanes. But in today's day and age and everyone practicing social distancing, disaster recovery is more akin to its cousin, business continuity, and how do organizations work with AWS to ensure that they can operate correctly, be it before, after, or during a hurricane, or during a pandemic like we're all dealing with right now. So Steve's going to talk about a range of important solutions and how they've enabled organizations to continue to operate very efficiently during the pandemic. So Steve, let me turn it over to you.
Awesome, thanks Ron. Once again, my name is Steve Woodard. I'm a solutions architect for enterprise customers in the Florida area. And I work with customers on a range of topics and helping them identify and innovate in certain areas. All of that is wonderful. We love to see customers innovate, but at the same time that they're innovating, they don't want to look over the necessary component of their critical business strategy, which is how do I recover specific parts of my environment if in fact there is a disaster? And you could literally categorize 100 different items as to what could constitute as a disaster, or what could basically what categorizes itself as a catastrophic disaster. And we'll actually go through a couple of scenarios. So really quick, just want to talk about the agenda. Customer asked me, all right, so we want to have a multi-region architecture. What does that look like? What are the pros and cons? And then how do we maintain business continuity in a multi-region type of environment? We'll go through some examples of some architecture patterns that we see customers adopting today. And then we'll re-architect a single region to a multi-region active-active. And then we'll also talk about databases, which RDS is our managed database solution. Then we'll talk about what happens if I'm running my database on an EC2 instance. What are the pros and cons? And then how does S3 storage help me with these two components here? And I'll really be able to dive into those deeper here in the next couple of slides. But before we get started, a lot of times what I do is when I have this conversation with my customers about disaster recovery is that we have to really try to get on the same page with the definitions. There is a huge difference between what is highly available and what's disaster recovery. So if I'm thinking about high availability, I'm thinking about being able to continue that uptime for a specific application if I'm planning around a specific or single component failure. Now that's also different from fault tolerant, which when you're interacting with your customers, you really want to make sure that you define exactly what does it mean to you that an application is highly available. What is fault tolerance? What does that mean to you as an organization or as a customer? And another term I hear a lot is customers will say, well, we want our environment to be resilient. And that is a very ambiguous term as well, as that we really have to have the customer define what that means. Does that mean that we have to protect resources amongst availability zones? Does that mean that it has to be spread across the country in different regions? We really want to extract that information out from the customer so that way they can really tell us what that means. So that way we can start down the road of building the proper architecture that fits their requirements and fits their business requirements, their RTOs and RPOs. Again, disaster recovery, as we're planning for those things such as human errors, security breaches, geographic disasters. I live in Florida and have been since 1983. I have witnessed a lot of hurricanes that have come through here, and it's still surprising to me how many big customers still have data centers in the state of Florida. We have wind, we have water on both sides. It's, you know, it's kind of crazy in a way, but yet they are still around running data centers in both primary and colo facilities as well. So we want to find out from the customer, what is it we are trying to protect from, and have them really define exactly what it is that keeps them up at night. What are we planning for? Some initial questions to answer when you're talking with customers or talking to a business owner about high availability or disaster recovery is you want to talk about what's important to the business, right? So if this is a revenue generating application, we want to make sure it's got the highest level of uptime. If it's an application where it dispenses medicine to patients in pharmacies, you want to make sure that that has the highest level of uptime as well. Clearly identify what is the recovery point and the time for these applications. So what is the ability for us, what can we withstand to lose, and how long can these applications be down for? And those are typically written into your RPO and RPOs, and they're written into your application service level agreements. How's the data being stored? Where is it being stored? And then how are you going about the process to restore the application? And we'll get into a couple of these three options here in a couple of other slides, but I just want to go ahead and set everyone's expectation for what we're going to go through. So when I talk to customers, I was just trying to make sure that, you know, they understand the concept of availability zones. And these are segmented clusters of data center that are on separate floodplains, different power, so that way they're isolated for basically for a single point of failure. So you could lose one or more data center and still not have an availability zone go down. We have designed them to withstand as much failure as possible, so that way you don't have one or two data centers go down that take an entire AZ down. Each availability zone has hundreds of thousands of servers that could scale at any moment. And these are connected using our own fiber. So we don't rent, we don't basically lease the fiber from other telco or third-party providers. Is the fiber that connects these data centers belongs to Amazon. Now, every region has at least 2 or more availability zones. And then we get to talk about regions. Regions are simply composed of multiple availability zones that give you the ability to have high availability, scalability, and fault tolerance. So I can choose as an application owner or as a developer to deploy my application across 1, 2, 3, or more availability zones to give me that high availability and fault tolerance. This way I'm mitigating my risk of, well, what happens if this application goes down? What happens if this AZ goes down? So this way it gives me a chance to leverage the infrastructure that AWS has already been put in place. And most importantly is, do you want to have your applications closest to your customers? Let's say you're a company that basically does business internationally. Your users are not always based out of North America. You probably want to put resources closest to those users to give them the best performance and lowest latency when they're interacting with your applications. And that's the benefit of the multiple region design, is that you can span your applications all around the world. We also have 200 points of presence, or also known as edge locations or content delivery networks. So what does multi-region mean to AWS? So you see these numbers here, and these are basically regions. And what the numbers inside here represent, this is the number of availability zones within that geographic region. So Northern Virginia has 6 availability zones, Ohio has 3, and you see the 2 up there, I think that is the GovCloud. And GovCloud is for government entities who want to be able to house top secret and confidential information. And then you see this scattered out around across the US and of course throughout the world here, is that we have a huge global footprint where you can deploy resources, get as closest to your users with the lowest latency possible. And essentially multi-region active-active is simply defined as 2 or more active full stack regions. So if you're running in one region, you want to run out of a second region, and then you also basically want to weight traffic between the resources in region A and region B. This way it is completely transparent to your users. And if one of them goes offline, you're not too concerned because you don't have to do any flipping of any DNS. All of the data is already there, it's replicated. That's the big benefit of having a multi-region active-active solution. And customers say, well, why do I want to use multi-region? Well, it improves business continuity and it helps increase your disaster recovery plan. You have these services that are running out of basically US West And you also have services that are running out of US East and users are from New York. So if I start to experience component failures or application failures in one region, and these users in San Francisco are completely affected by that, I can simply just have them point over to resources in another region with very, very little effort. And I think the time for Route 53 to propagate is just a few moments. Now, another thing I want to talk about is S3 and its durability. So what does that really mean? So S3 is object level storage, and it's a region-based construct. It's designed for 11 nines of durability. And what that means is we get basically ensure that any data that you upload into an S3 bucket, you have the propensity to lose one object every 10 million years. And the way that we do that is a little bit of magic under the hood, is that every time you initiate a put command of an object into an S3 bucket, is that we are also taking that data, taking the metadata, and then we're replicating that data to all of the data centers within every single AZ within that region. And that's how we give you 11 nines of durability. So if we have one data center that goes down, two data centers that goes down, your data will still be there. And that's the assurance of this 11 nines of durability. It's very, very high. Even when I worked with many systems in the late 90s and early 2000s with on-premises, we had big multi-billion, big multi-million-dollar budgets. We never had anything close to 11 nines of durability. Now with the cloud is that you now can actually have the 11 nines of durability and 5 nines of availability. And the good thing about S3 storage is it's about 0.02 cents per gig. You only pay for what you use. Now, I just want to mention here is the thing with S3 is how we are taking your data that we're replicating that out. AWS will never replicate your data outside of the region. So S3 is a regional based construct. So you're creating a bucket in a region. AWS will never replicate that data to a different region. That's going to be the responsibility of the customer or the bucket owners to say, well, if S3 goes down to this region, how do we get it restored back into a different region? You would then want to do something like cross-region replication, where you're taking ownership over replicating that data. So that's a decision that customers have to make. Again, within S3 availability zones, S3 stores data at least 3 availability zones. Each AZ can be up to 8 physical data centers, and the unavailability of that data center or all AZs do not impact the overall service 3 availability. It's a very important thing to note here is because we can withstand multiple failures of data centers at availability zones, and your data is still there. It's a quite amazing construct. As I mentioned before, is that let's say you wanted to take your data and move it for basically migrate it or copy it from region A to region B. In S3 is that you have a feature called cross-region replication, and this gives you, the customer, the ability to take that data, replicate it over to a different region, and it will basically replicate all of the objects, the buckets, the prefix, the ACLs, the bucket policies, all of that stuff will get replicated over to a different region. And this is great for if you wanted to maintain high availability and durability. So if you're planning for just a what if scenario, or if you want to have data in a different bucket to serve customers in a different region, that data can be there more that's local to them versus having to go all the way back to your primary region. So the closer to your users you can get, the better latency or the lower latency you'll have. Let's talk about a couple of backup patterns before we talk about disaster recovery. So if I'm launching an EC2 instance, I'm going to provision an EBS volume. Basically, it attaches to an instance. Let's think of it like your virtual hard drive. Now, this is an availability zone construct. You can create an EBS volume. You only pay for what you use. And now we have a feature built in called Snapshot Manager. And it's an automated way of creating snapshots of your EBS volumes. Underneath the hood, all of that data is stored into S3. Remember before we basically have 11 nines of durability with object level storage? You have the same 11 nines of durability when it comes to EBS snapshots. And the great thing about Snapshot Manager is that you can set the policies as to how many number of backups do you want to retain, How long do you want to retain them? Do you want to add tags to them? So that way you know what are production volumes, test volumes, non-production volumes. You can now associate those with taggings. And all of that is stored into S3. Now, you also have a feature that you can go into EBS and you can actually copy that snapshot over to a different region or to a different availability zone. So let's just say if that server becomes unavailable and you need to get it up and running into a different region or different AZ, you've already got that data copied over. Just start up a new instance, reattach that EBS volume to that instance, and you're back up and running in a few minutes. EFS, it also works with EFS, and EFS is our elastic file system. This is for Linux workloads. And this allows you to have a shareable file system across instances, because you cannot share an EBS volume with multiple EC2 instances. There is a new feature now called EBS multi-attach, but that is only for certain instance types. If I wanted to create a series of web servers or maybe a web farm and I wanted to have a shareable file system, I could basically use EFS as a scalable file system that I could attach all of those instances to, and they all share the same data. I could even point my on-prem resources to an EFS mount target using an NFS protocol. And customers love to do that because they'll be able to leverage cloud technology along with their on-premise data center. And they'll be able to do things like such as backup recovery, disaster recovery. They'll be able to do things like analytics, data copy, and even cloud bursting. Cloud bursting is a feature where you basically scale to the limit of your data center, and then after that point, you don't have any more capacity. This is a great way for you to also now leverage the cloud because you have the elasticity and scalability because you can provision resources in just a few minutes. Now there's a lot of talk about, all right, so I've got EBS volumes and I have RDS snapshots, and I hear that there's basically S3 cross-region replication. Which one do I use and when? I'll tell you a secret is if you're using EBS, it is a best practice to make sure that you are copying that snapshot over to different regions, just in case if you have to restore those resources. With RDS snapshots, you will also want to do the exact same thing, is to take the snapshots, copy them over into different regions, and all of that data is stored into an S3 bucket. The thing about it is that when you're storing the snapshots in S3, you don't really see an S3 bucket, but under the hood, the way we've baked basically everything into the console for you is that those snapshots are stored in S3. The benefit to that gives you the 11 nines of durability. So that ensures that your data, your integrity is still there, even if in fact, if there is a component failure, your data is not going to be lost. A new tool that we launched not too long ago is a feature called AWS Backup. And this is a way for you to automate backup across different services like Elastic Block Store, EFS, RDS, DynamoDB, and even leveraging Storage Gateway. It's an automated tool that you can go in, select exactly what options you want to basically back up, select what region you want to back up to, and it will automatically provision or basically take all that data and back it up for you. This way it works as a simplified and unified backup strategy, and you can even implement lifecycle management across the services. So if I wanted to, I could move data from one environment to the next. After it gets to a certain age, I can then dispose of it. Let's say it's data that's been 90 days or 100 days old. You say, well, we don't need to keep that around anymore. You can simply amend a lifecycle policy, and that data can then basically be purged after so long of a time. So I was working with a customer and I really asked them basically, so what is it that we are really planning for? What is the ultimate thing that keeps you up at night? And they said, Godzilla stepping on a region. That's what keeps us up at night, is what happens if a region goes down? Perfectly legitimate question. And if that's what we're planning for, then we need to start targeting an architecture that meets the requirement of a multi-region active-active. and then we get into disaster recovery. And every business, whether you're a startup or an enterprise customer that's been around for some time, is every business requires data protection, whether you're protecting from natural disasters, infrastructure availability. I've known numerous times where there has been a road crew that's been out somewhere doing some road construction. They dig up some T1 lines, and then literally almost half of the town is now affected, and that impacts a lot of businesses. So that's why we basically say, if you're trying to protect from one of those, that's a scenario we can definitely plan for. And even rogue actors, even for those people who basically, are working internally, who may be up to no good, nefarious things. I'm not sure if anybody remembers the logic bomb from 2009. If you don't remember it, then definitely Google logic bomb 2009. It's a really scary story about how an employee who was going to be terminated set a logic bomb script to basically destroy and delete the entire company's resources. And the company's resources was mortgages. So that would have been catastrophic to that business had somebody not found that script before it was going to go off. But if that's a contingency plan that we're trying to plan for, the rogue actor scenario, you need to decide that one account is just simply not enough. We always advise going with a multi-account, multi-VPC strategy. And the reason for that is because you want to start isolating workloads and start basically granting access to those people who only need to have access to it. Let's say you want to have an account just for billing. You don't want everyone to have access to billing. Let's say security and compliance, they need to have their own account. This way they can make sure that there's no other hands in there. Workload isolation and business process. A multi-account strategy is by far the best and sound approach. The downside to that is that it can be overly complex to manage. When you start getting into a lot of these different types of multi-accounts, the question is, well, how do I as an organization manage these? We have a feature called AWS Organizations, and it's a managed service that allows you to tie a root account. And then all of these other accounts under here are all sub or child accounts. So I've got an account for security. Security has their own account. I have an infrastructure account for things like network and shared services. And let's say I've got a couple of different workloads in here as well. All of these accounts can tie up under a master payer organization or a root account. The benefit to this is visibility. You can set budget controls. And another great thing is that you can also set service control policies that allows you to basically restrict what resources certain accounts can spin up. So let's say, for example, you have a development environment and you implement a policy that says you can't do any type of machine learning, deep learning, or any type of crazy analytics because you're only focusing on doing X, Y, and Z. This helps keep your billing costs low because only those accounts that need to spin up those resources can have that policy. And this is something that you can custom build as your organization sees fit. I've also worked with some customers where they actually have a disaster recovery administrative team account. And this is only for people that are within this disaster recovery admin team to specifically protect them from those rogue actors where if they go into a VPC or an account, they delete things. There's another team, network segmentation and segmentation of roles responsibilities. They can then quickly provision and recover those resources using infrastructure as code or automation. Business continuity, again, the question comes into is, all right, so you have this application running. My question to you is, how much data can you afford to lose or to recreate? If you're processing credit cards in real time, you may have a very high risk tolerance where you say we can't lose more than 1 hour. You would probably never say, oh, we could lose 24 hours worth of data and that would be fine. That would be really, really too conservative. And the second question is how quickly must you recover? And what's the cost of that downtime? So think about those mission critical applications that need to run 24/7. So you really got to do a kind of a comparison of these two factors to really create your RTO and RPO and really try to mitigate from that disaster and then you have to define what that disaster is we're trying to plan for. Think about the services that you can leverage with cloud native tools such as RDS, which is a managed relational database, Elasticache, which you can run an ELK stack, S3 for object-based storage, Aurora, EC2 instance recovery for problematic machines that experience those occasional problems where you have to troubleshoot an instance to find out why it's not running. And then think about what applications do you have that are running between regions. And DynamoDB is our NoSQL database that allows you to create a highly distributed multi-master environment using DynamoDB global tables. And it allows you to have that high availability and fault tolerance and get it closest to your users as possible with sub-millisecond response time. That's awesome, sub-millisecond response time. Let's take a look at an example here of a strategy for a backup and restore within a multi-region. We have all of our app servers that are hitting a backup server, and they're sending all of those backups over to a different region. Again, this is a best practice we advise customers to do. This way you say, well, the apps are down, the region's down, we can't restore any backups, therefore we're not in any better situation. Always be thinking about making sure that that data is highly available into a different region. When it comes to disaster recovery, there are 4 different types of perspectives or 4 different types of approach. Backup and restore, which you see here, basically the RTO and RPO is in hours. Pilot light, which we'll talk about. Warm standby, and hot site multi-active. The difference here is this. The RTO and RPO for pilot light is tens of minutes. And then when you look at hot standby, the RTO and RPO is in real time. But as you see, the bottom line here is that you start to see the cost associated with it. So as we are trying to get more into real-time recovery, the cost factor goes up. If there's something that you want to do to tier your application somewhere between pilot light, warm standby, and multi-site, great. But if you have a use case and you need to have it in real time, then multi-site and multi-region is going to be your best bet. Now let's talk a little bit about pilot light and what that looks like. The pilot light is really a very, very small footprint that's running over here on the right. So you see all my resources running out of the left at a US West 2. I've got my app servers, web server, and I have my database server. It's replicating the data over to the other region. Now in this scenario, I only have one server running, that's my web server, and I'm basically just keeping that up every month to patch it. Now you could patch it and turn the instance off, and then whenever there's a failure, is that you can leverage Route 53 as your global traffic manager. You can basically point that traffic over to the other region, start your instances up, which will just take a few moments, and then you can be up and running in tens of minutes. And a lot of customers do this to keep their footprint and their cost very, very small. The second option is the warm standby option. It's kind of the same scenario, is that you have your primary environment running over here in US West 2, and you're using Route 53 to route all your DNS traffic. And over in my secondary region, I've got 2 servers that are running, but maybe they're running in an auto-scaling group. And the benefit to the auto-scaling group is that it can scale out or scale up your resources as traffic and as load increases. So let's say I have an absolute failure over here for whatever reason in my primary region. Route 53 also does health checks. So it will detect if there's basically a failure, and that failure could be it's failed to respond to a ping request. It'll then institute a failover policy, and that failover policy is telling it to go to AP Southwest or Southeast 1. At that time, those resources start to basically scale out as load starts to increase. So the great thing about this is elasticity and scalability. So you can scale out in response to that traffic demand, and then you can scale back in slowly as the traffic dies down again. And third, we talk about a multi-site active-active. And really this looks like this, is that we have a like-for-like environment running in 2 different locations. And in some cases, we have customers that are actually using Route 53 to do a weighted what we call a weighted traffic policy where it says, send 60% of my customers over to my primary site, and then maybe send 40% of my other customers, or basically just send 40% of the traffic over to resources into a different region. To the end users, it's completely transparent. They don't even know what resources they're accessing. But the benefit here is that in the event of a failure is that you have all of your resources up and running, your data is replicated, and they can be scaled up for production use. So you can scale out or scale up to meet load. And that's a huge benefit here with active-active. But again, the downside is cost because you're having to run two environments similar, exactly like in two different regions. So we see a lot of customers doing this as basically modernizing disaster recovery with automation. And this is a real preferred approach, is that things like networking, VPCs, instances, they take a long time to build out if you're doing them manually. What we advise you to do is to basically package up all of those resources into a CloudFormation template. A lot of customers use Terraform, but you can then build out your resources in a CloudFormation template. You can feed it through your CI/CD pipeline. And in the event of any disaster, you can simply take that template and then spin up those resources in a different region. This way, of course, it helps improve the amount of time it will take, because if you're paged at 3 o'clock in the morning that a region goes down and you have to build those things from scratch, you're going to have to start looking for runbooks and all the different types of things. The best approach is to have all of this stuff already scripted in a CloudFormation template. You just fire the template off and it can build out all of your resources. And another thing is that CloudFormation can also detect drift and also can audit that as well too. CloudFormation stacks, you can use this based on different environments. Again, the powerful ability of infrastructure as code is that you can basically set your CloudFormation stacks to work across different regions, across multiple accounts, and you can express your code in either JSON or YAML. And it also has a really nice Visio-like designer inside there as well. So if you're not really into JSON or YAML, that's cool. You can simply use the CloudFormation designer. It's a Visio style look. You can drag and drop your icons and it will build the code down below in the console for you. So with all that being said, a couple of takeaways here is to basically make sure that if you don't test, it won't work in a crisis. I asked customers this, I said, do you have a DR plan? They say yes. And I asked the next question, I say, when was the last time you tested it? And they say, oh, it's been quite some time. That's probably something we should revisit. Because if you don't test it, how do you know it's gonna work? Best advice is to start small, look at a couple of different workloads, practice your game days, and also check for any type of licensing issues on every application you're working with to make sure that there's no issues with licensing compliance. And that is it for disaster recovery. Now, that is just scratching the surface. This is really a really deep, deep topic, but I just wanted to make sure that I had a chance to talk with you, basically highlight a couple things that we're seeing customers use. And now you can go and have discussions with your IT managers and your colleagues about what your disaster recovery plan is and how AWS can help you with that.
Well, Steve, it's Ron Gerber now. That was extremely interesting. I'm amazed at all of the technology, planning, infrastructure, strategies that AWS has put in behind the scenes. And you can just see that when organizations do their DR, business continuity planning, it's always difficult. And you're making such a critically important task be so easy. That's sort of my takeaway after listening to your fascinating comments.
Yeah, a lot of things I remember, and of course, I was working for enterprise customers in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, and we would always have to, we dreaded the day when we had to basically go through and do our DR failover and fail back. It required hundreds of IT people from different disciplines to make sure that everything failed over. You think about it now is that you really now can get to a part of you can have things automated. You can do things through orchestration, automation configuration, and you really can do this all through a single pane of glass, which makes it really effortless now. So You know, DR isn't one of those things that you dread to do anymore. Some customers have to prove that their DR plan works every year for their compliance team. Their compliance team checks and audits them. So now that we're in the cloud era, you know, disaster recovery, it doesn't tend to be as daunting as it used to be. It's actually really cool when you get a chance to see how you can do a failover and fail back, spin up resources in different regions within a few moments, pay for what you use, and then when you're not using those resources, the great benefit is if you're not using those resources, they're not running, you're not paying anything. Versus the capital expenditure that you would have to do on-prem, purchase all the equipment, let it sit there for 6 months to a year, completely idle, you're still paying depreciation on it, and that tends to be very, very costly over time. I'm not sure if you're talking on mute, Ron. I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. All right. One of the things that I was commenting, and I appreciate you pointing that out, Steve, is that as people emerge from this pandemic, everyone's job is going to change, and everyone wants to be more focused on strategic issues in general and not so much on detailed setting up servers and switches and routers and the stuff. It's going to also provide some opportunities for people who follow Steve's direction to be much more strategic and be more of an architect as opposed to a pure operator.
Yeah, because you think of it this way as, you know, if I were to ask you, how much of your time do you currently spend? For example, is DBAs. If I were to ask them, how much of your time do you think is spent on being the infrastructure guy, being the administrator, managing all of your backups, the full stack? And then on top of that, you have to be the database administrator to ensure that your database is working. And they'll give you a crazy number. They'll say probably 80% of my time is spent doing a lot of those things. If we can offload those tasks and give you a managed service that just simply allows you, a DBA, to focus on your SQL queries and your app optimization, think about how much more you can innovate and think about how other think about other things that you can also solve if we were to basically kind of take those things away from you, or basically take those things off your plate, provide them as a managed service, and then now you can spend a lot more time thinking about innovation, about cool new things, about a new go-to-market strategy, about how this could be a real shift and culture change within inside your organization. So these are all pluses.
Well, this is great. Well, I'm going to encourage everyone to look at angelbeat.com for the latest information. You can use hashtag AngelBeat. We'll have all this content available digitally at our website. If you've got any questions, you can use Contact Us. We can channel your questions to Steve. And if you're not in the great state of Florida, Steve obviously has a wealth of contacts throughout the United States or the world who can help address your questions wherever you might be. Other than that, I wish everyone the best. And Steve, if you don't have anything else, I'm going to end the webinar now.
Thanks, Ron, for having me. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.